Hey, Travis here at Books, Builds, and More, and welcome to part 2 of my review of Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. That's right. My first video covered only the first story, the novella The Mist, in this collection, because I wanted that separated for the purposes of my Dark Tower reading adventure this year, so I could keep that in the playlist all by itself. But this video will cover the entire rest of the book. And before I get started on that, just a quick overall synopsis of this overall book that I did not cover when I covered The Mist in my previous video. But the short stories in this one were quite on the wide spectrum. One thing I did like about this collection was the fact that this one all kind of seemed to pull Stephen King's universe together in a way. For example, what I mean by that is there were at least three stories in here that referenced characters from other stories. Like, for example, the character of Joe Camber was mentioned twice in two different stories in this collection. And he was a character, of course, from the book Cujo. And then from The Body, from his, which was a novella from different seasons, his collection, Ace Merrill and Vern Tessio, at least, were two of those characters that were mentioned in another story in here. So that kind of helped, kind of collate Stephen King's universe a little bit. And also, there was a wild motif in here that I thought, and it's on the, it's at the beginning. It's just very, very simple line. I think it's do you love? There are several stories in here that use that line in different contexts, but still throughout the book. So it's almost like that's the theme of the book, the overall collection. And it just seems to tie everything together in this neat little universal package in a way, and just kind of connects everything, even though all these stories are, or most of them are, quite different and in totally different, respects. Still, it was an average collection for me, and without further ado, let's get started, because this video is probably going to be long enough as it is with me covering all these stories, but I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. And I'll, like I said already, I've touched on The Mist, but just as a reminder, that was a 3.5-star read for me. The second story after that is one called Here There Be Tigers. That one locked in at a 1.5-star rating for me. It was a very short story, but not because of that reasoning. It's just because the story just didn't have any substance for me. It was about this kid a third grader who had to pee really bad in class one day. And so he got up to go to the bathroom and saw a tiger in the bathroom. And it was just an odd little story, but it had potential. And that's what irked me the most about it. It came off as like a sort of draft. Well, not really a draft, but more like a pitch idea for something that had a lot more potential, for like a much larger story. And that's just the way it came off. I just didn't get it. I just didn't get anything out of this story. Now, it was just 1 star. I gave it a 0.5 star. I bumped it up because I liked one part about the disturbing fact that there was a tiger in the bathroom, and there was this involvement, shall we say, of this other kid besides the main boy in this story, and the teacher, the mean teacher. So something happens there that it just left me wanting more. So that's why I say it felt like a pitch idea. Now, oftentimes, I have agreed with people that Stephen King's strong point in writing is his short stories for the most part. However, I do think that just like his novels, his short stories can also be hit or miss at sometimes. But definitely his strongest point is short stories. But that particular short story, well, along with a few others, just didn't work for me. So yeah, Here There Be Tigers at 1.5 stars. The third story in the book, The Monkey. Now, this one was just recently made into an adaptation, I believe, about a year ago, maybe 2. I can't remember. It's been recent. And it tells the story of this man who's obsessed with one of those little wind-up toy monkeys, that plays the cymbals. I think pretty popular toy back in the day. But of course, obviously, it's a simple story about the demonic toy, the possessed toy. I think there have been several iterations in all forms of medium with that kind of theme. So his obsession with that and the danger that it brings, but it's a very, very good story. And that one is one of the most memorable ones for me in this book, and it clocked in at 4.5 stars. The next one after that was Cain Rose Up. Now, that was a truly terrifying story. I only gave it 3 stars, though, because I felt there was something very lacking about it. But it was probably the most realistic story in this entire collection for me because of its content. And it's basically about this college student who just snaps and goes on a shooting spree, basically. And it's but you have to read the context. You have to read the text, basically, and read the narrative and really get a feel for it. But again, it only got 3 stars for me, but is a super disturbing story just because of the reality of it. The next story is Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, and I said this in The Mist, I believe, that this is the other short story in the book that I believe has connections to the Dark Tower, or could have connections to the Dark Tower, because something happens in that story that reminds me of a lot of things that happen in Wizard and Glass, book 4 of the series. So, but still, I only gave this one 4 stars, which is still a pretty high rating because despite the Dark Tower possible reference, I thought it was a very good story. I still thought it was a very good story. It ended on such a wild note that it's one of the most memorable ones for me, but not as high as some of the others in here, but still was a 4-star read. The next story after that, The Jaunt. Oh my gosh, that is by far my favorite story in this collection, hands down. It came in at 4.75 stars. It was just about a 5-star read for me. Not quite though, because there was something a little bit lacking in that. But this is a science fiction story. Now, Stephen King has done his fair share of sci-fi, but this is a really, I don't think he's ever done anything as in-depth sci-fi as this, or maybe he has. But there's another sci-fi story later in this story, and I'll obviously get to that. But this one it takes place, I think it feels undisclosed, but I feel like there was it was specified sort of, or at least hinted at, how far in the future takes place, and people can now travel via these portals, but it requires, something to do with your mind. And I'm just going to leave it at that because it's a very strange story, but it's a very very nice story. It's a very good story. Particularly the ending. That ending was one of the most horrific things. I did not see that coming at all. I would think that I would, and I kind of got the feeling that something like what happened at the end was going to happen. I just didn't know it would happen that way. So yeah, it just totally took me by surprise, and this one was a 4.75. I mean, after walking away feeling that kind of horror from something like that, yeah, that one was high up. Okay, and then the one after that, completely disappointed. That's my second 1-star read, and it is a flat 1 star. It doesn't even get a half star like at least Here There Be Tigers got bumped up a little bit. This one is called The Wedding Gig, and it just, I did not care for that one at all. I just did not care for it at all. It kind of dealt with the mob in a way, and gangster storylines, which is usually not something I enjoy reading about. I mean, I have nothing against it. I just feel like it's a bit cliche a lot of times, so I don't really get into mob, mafia, gangster type stories all that well. But the biggest thing about this, and yes, this did have an effect on my rating, but not wholly, was the fact that there was a a ton of fat phobia in this story, which I absolutely cannot condone in any way, shape, form, or fashion. That really kind of brought down the story for me as it was. It was already bad enough, and then that just made it worse. But yeah, I just could not, I just did not like this story at all. The next one is called Paranoid, a Chant, and this is one of two poems in this collection. And this one is, both of these poems in this book are unrhyming, but this first one was only 2 stars. Paranoid, a Chant, it's about this character who's basically suffering from some kind of what they used to refer to as schizophrenia. So it's but basic paranoia is what it is, and quite extreme. But I I don't know, I just didn't care for it a whole lot. It was described very, very vividly, and you could tell this poor character is totally losing it or has already lost it. But there was just something lacking about it. But again, I felt like it had potential. After that, we have The Raft. Now, I saw Creepshow 2 several years ago, and if I remember, it's like the second or third story in that movie. It's been so long, but I do remember that it being a short story by Stephen King. Well, that short story is in this collection. I gave it 4 stars. It pretty much follows the same uh, formula, in the movie back then, that I recall, of course, except the ending. Although the end, it still ends the same, it's just done differently in the movie than it was the book, because the ending was quite memorable in the movie. And yeah, I gave it 4 stars because it still evoked that same feeling I got from when I saw the movie. It was just that claustrophobic, that fear, of something like that could happen. Not really, because I don't think anything like what lived in that lake exists, of course. It's basically a simple monster story. So, yeah, there you have it. After The Raft, we have Word Processor of the Gods, which is 4.5 stars. This was another one of my favorites from the collection. And it reminded me of an old Twilight Zone episode that kind of did the same premise about an author who has a word processor or even just a typewriter back in the Twilight Zone, the ability to write and alter reality just through your writing. And that's all I'm going to say about it, because I definitely don't want to spoil this, but oh man, what a concept. And this just, yeah, it was by far one of my favorite stories in this collection. The story after that one was called The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands. That one was 3.75 stars. I gave that one, and it was a wild premise. Basically, it's the Midas touch gone wrong. I really don't want to spoil this one, but it was a really good story. It's more than just that, though. It's more than just because I love the fact. I've always loved the concept of the Midas touch. With it's either a gift or a curse. You can touch something and whatever happened. It's basically like a superpower of sorts. But when it's a curse, especially when it's a curse, whoever has that ability, it's just that sense of isolation, feeling isolated, like you have no contact, no touch, no human connections. So that's what always makes it wild for me. But still, I mean, it was an enjoyable story. It was not quite as high up as a lot of the other stories in this book, but it was pretty good. After that one, we had Beach World, which was the other sci-fi tale in the book. And I still like the jaunt. Nothing's going to beat the jaunt in this book. I'm sorry, it's not. But, well, unless you count The Mist in one point. So that would be 3 sci-fi, basically, tales. But anyway, moving on with Beach World, about these 2 astronauts who kind of crash land on this planet that's nothing but like beach sand, and it seems to be sentient. The sand seems to be sentient, and there are androids involved. So yeah, sci-fi, it clocked in at 3 stars for me. It was a good story, but just not quite as good as The Jaunt. Nowhere near as I thought. And yeah, that's basically all this. You would just have to read it. After Beach World, this story, The Reaper's Image, about this demonic mirror, basically. So hardly an original concept in that respect, but I gave it 2.75 stars. I got Edgar Allan Poe vibes from this story, which is not a bad thing. But again, it felt almost like Here There Be Tigers, in the fact that it just felt pitch idea-ish, where it just was something that had more potential to be something larger. So that's what I got out of that one. But this one had a far more sinister vibe to it. So I did enjoy that part of it, but still not one of the greatest in the collection for me. Next, we have Nona, which is about this guy in prison who's talking about this, who's kind of recounting this story is mostly in flashback, where he meets this mysterious woman, and they kind of go on this sort of odd Bonnie and Clyde-ish adventure in a way. You would just have to read it. I'm trying not to spoil anything about any of this, but it ends quite. Let me just say this. What in the world is it with Stephen King and rats? What is it with him and rats? I mean, I've read so many things by Stephen King that just contain rats. I mean, is it like his spirit animal or something? I'm not sure, but that's all I'm going to say about this story. But let me tell you, it was a 4-star read. It was a pretty good story. I really did enjoy that one. Next up after that one is the second poem in the book, and it's called For Owen. And this is actually a poem that Stephen King wrote for his son, Owen. Or he got the idea from it from, I think, where he was walking his kid to school that day, and his son just kind of, started spewing out his imagination about fruit coming to life and becoming anthropomorphic or something like that. So Stephen King got the idea, and I thought that was a pretty cool way to get an idea. But like a lot of authors, especially Stephen King, draws a lot of inspiration from his stories based on just, even these seemingly minute instances in his life, where he draws inspiration from. And this one was a cool one. I gave it 3 stars just simply for it was very imaginative. Yeah, I did enjoy that one. Next up, we have Survivor Top, which is a 4.5-star read. Definitely one of the most memorable stories in this collection. First of all, it's told entirely in an epistolary fashion. It's, we get all these journal entries from this surgeon who is stranded on this little tiny deserted island. But long story short, which is actually not that long of a story, but you know what I mean. He finds some pretty inventive ways, shall we say, to survive on this island. But at the same time, he starts to kind of, lose his faculties, so to speak. It's an extremely disturbing story, and it plays personally on one of my fears that, the prospect of being stranded like that, complete isolation, not knowing if you're ever going to be rescued, and you don't know how you're going to survive something like that, just absolutely terrifies me. So for me personally, it kind of hit home there, and which is why another reason why I gave it the high rating that I did, because it's just such a oh man, it's one of the most memorable stories. Not my favorite, but I think it would be probably my second one in this collection. After that, we have Uncle Otto's Truck. That one was a 2-star read. It just was not okay. It was an okay story. It was an okay premise, but the execution, no offense to R.L. Stine or Goosebumps or anything like that, but especially what happened in the end, it just overall came out as a Goosebumps episode on steroids. It just had this kind of ridiculous, silly vibe to it, particularly the way it ended. But the imagery throughout the book just kind of felt like that as well. Now, that's just what I got out of it. A lot of people tend to really enjoy that story. I just didn't. Now, the next two stories go together because they feature a common character, and one of the characters from the second story is only mentioned in the first one, so they are definitely connected. And it's about they're called Milkman number one and Milkman number two, subtitled, but they do actually have their own individual titles. The first one is called Morning Deliveries, Milkman number one, and it's about this milkman who starts his morning deliveries in this kind of quiet suburb neighborhood that, in dawn, early morning. And it's the picture of it just was just so wild. It cracked me up. I was like literally laughing out loud reading this story as it went on, because he's just making regular deliveries, but in some of these like select deliveries, some of the spots he delivers to, he kind of adds something really gruesome and or fatal to it, and it just absolutely cracked me up. Now, I gave that one 3.75 stars, but at first I only gave it 3 stars just for the sheer entertainment value. But then I read the second story, which is called Big Wheels, A Tale of the Laundry Game. And what happened in that story, it was a bit longer, but the first one was better. The second one, I only gave 3 stars to. But it's like what happened in the second one just kind of enhanced the first one a little bit. It kind of went reversed for me this way, and it was just very odd, but I enjoyed the first one a lot more after the second one, because the milkman, at least he was entertaining. The characters in that second one are just I didn't like them. I didn't care for them at all. They were just gross, and deserved what they got, I guess. And anyway, trying not to spoil it here, not doing a too good a job of that, I guess. But anyway, I did give it 3 stars because we did get the milkman back in the second story, and we get a little bit more about what he was about. But it was just, I don't know. As a whole, it worked, because if it were just the first story, I would probably be in the same frame of mind as like Here There Be Tigers and the Reaper's Image, where I'd be like, where's the rest of it? Like, is that it? It's just yet another pitch idea. But it actually paid off in the second one. Okay, so after those two stories, we get a story called Grandma, about this 11-year-old kid who is kind of left to stay alone and watch over his grandmother who is dying in a room. But there's a lot more to her than you would expect. And this is played upon heavily throughout the book until it culminates the way it does. I'm not going to say anything more about this story. I gave it 4.25 stars. It was pretty high up there, not quite as high as a few of the other stories earlier in this book, but it definitely can hold its own with the best of them in there, and it was a very good story. It was very atmospheric, so yeah, I loved it. Now, the next one was a bit interesting to me. It's called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet, and I ended up giving it 4 stars because it got better to me toward the end, and here's why. Now, in the beginning, it was going to be I was like, okay, this is going to be very, very low, because it was just so boring. In fact, I was like borderline close to DNFing just that story and just like kind of skimming through it, maybe, if not DNFing it. But the more I read, the more I got into it, and I started enjoying it because the story is about this editor who's kind of telling this story, this flashback story about this author, this guy who writes that he was editing for. And the editor's kind of like alcoholic. But the writer in question is, his sanity is being questioned because there's this issue where these little elves, so there's a little bit of a fantasy element going on with this story. Little tiny elves living in his typewriter. And because of the alcoholism of the editor and questioning his own sanity, becomes kind of to the point where he comes off as an unreliable narrator, which is one of my favorite tropes in books because it's so. Because after that, you don't know what's going on. And I love the thrill of being able to try to figure out what is going on. So that's what upped it up. That's what got it up to a 4-star status for me, is that. And that's all I'm going to say about it. You would just have to read it. But yeah, at the first, it was a slow burn at first, but then it picked up and it started getting a lot more interesting after that. And the last story in the collection is one of my most memorable ones from this collection. I think the collection ended on a very nice note. It was a 4.5-star read called The Reach. And speaking of Twilight Zone, going back to Twilight Zone, that I mentioned in one story earlier, this one felt like one of those Twilight Zone episodes, but one of the one from the original series, but one of the ones that tug at the heartstrings, but done in a Stephen King style. And you just get a really nice little, shall we say, ghost story. I loved the metaphor of this story. It symbolizes, kind of going into something a lot larger. I just leave it at that because I want to spoil it, but I can't. But it was a very memorable story. I thought it was one of the probably the most unique story in that regard for me in this whole collection. So after calculating every individual average for these stories and then rounding up, the overall collection is a 3.5-star read for me. One of his middle of the road collections for me, not one of my favorites, but my top stories, I would have to say in this one, my top recommendations for this collection, the ones that are my favorites, and I'm going to remember most about this, are The Jaunt, definitely, absolutely, hands down. The Reach, Word Processor of the Gods, Survivor Type, and The Monkey. Those are my top 5 reads for this, with honorable mentions, Mrs. Todd's Shortcut and The Raft, and probably Grandma. So yeah, those are my recommendations for this collection. Not the worst collection, but not the best either. And that's it. That wraps up my review, finally, for Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. If you've stuck with me through both of these videos, particularly this one, which is much longer, and I apologize for that. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.